He spent nearly 18 years waiting for this moment. Strapped to a gurney in a Texas execution chamber, Richard Tabler turned toward the families watching him and mouthed two silent words that would become the most debated part of his entire story. Some saw remorse, others saw performance. But how does a man responsible for 4 brutal deaths end his life apologizing, and does it mean anything at all? This wasn't a crime of impulse or a life cut short by a single bad decision. It was a slow-burning descent fueled by revenge, paranoia, and choices that echoed for decades. And what happened in his final hours only made the questions harder to answer. Richard Tabler didn't look like a monster in the beginning. Born in California in 1979, his early life was quiet in the most dangerous way: neglect, instability, and no one paying close attention. By his teens and early 20s, he was already in trouble, stacking up convictions for burglary and assault, but nothing that set off alarms. He wasn't infamous. He wasn't feared. He was just another troubled guy drifting through the system. By his mid-20s, Tabler headed to Central Texas, bouncing between jobs and bad decisions, trying to outrun a past that kept catching up with him. To the people around him, he was forgettable. And that's what makes what came next so unsettling. Because beneath that unremarkable exterior, something was building, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to come out. But the trigger wasn't some dramatic betrayal or life-altering loss. It was something far smaller, and far more dangerous. The turning point came inside a strip club in Central Texas. Tabler picked up work there, blending into the background, until a clash with the manager changed everything. He was banned from the club, cut off, humiliated, and left stewing in his own anger. To most people, it would have been just another job gone wrong. To Tabler, it became personal. The resentment didn't fade, it deepened. He became obsessed with a former boss and a dispute so minor it almost sounds unbelievable. A confrontation that allegedly ended with a threat toward Tabler's family over just $10. Whether that threat was real or exaggerated didn't matter. In Tabler's mind, the line had been crossed. What started as wounded pride hardened into something colder. He didn't lash out, he waited. And while everyone else moved on, Tabler was already imagining payback. But revenge wasn't going to be loud or impulsive. It was going to be deliberate. And when he finally acted, he chose a moment when no one would see it coming. Thanksgiving weekend, 2004. While families were gathering and highways were packed with holiday travelers, Richard Tabler was laying the groundwork for something far darker. He didn't rush it. He picked the timing carefully, knowing distractions were everywhere. That Friday night, he and an 18-year-old accomplice set a trap just outside town. The bait was simple: a fake deal involving stolen stereo equipment. The location was isolated. The targets thought they were meeting for a quick exchange. Instead, they were walking into an ambush. One of them was Tabler's former boss, the man he blamed for everything that had gone wrong in his life. The moment they arrived, the illusion shattered. Without warning, Tabler pulled a 9mm handgun and opened fire. Chaos erupted in the darkness as bullets tore through the vehicle. But this wasn't a panicked outburst. It was controlled, intentional. And then came a detail that still turns stomachs. Tabler ordered the entire attack to be recorded. As the camera rolled and the victims lay wounded, it became clear this wasn't just about killing. It was about preserving the moment. And what he did next proved the night was far from over. After the gunfire stopped, the worst part still hadn't happened. One of the men was still alive, badly wounded but breathing. Tabler dragged him from the vehicle, stood over him in the darkness, and fired one final shot at point-blank range. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't panic. It was an execution. Investigators would later uncover just how calculated the entire night had been. In the days leading up to the ambush, Tabler had bought the handgun, a camcorder, and even a pickup truck specifically for the plan. Nothing was spontaneous. Every step had been thought through long before Thanksgiving ever arrived. This wasn't a crime driven by emotions spiraling out of control. It was revenge carried out with patience and precision. The camera, the timing, the final shot, it all pointed to one chilling truth. Tabler wanted to relive what he'd done. And as horrifying as that realization was, it only scratched the surface. Because just 2 days later, he decided loose ends weren't enough. He wanted silence. 2 days later, the violence followed him back to the strip club. This time, the targets weren't rivals or perceived enemies. They were 2 teenage girls who worked there, both young, both vulnerable, and one of them someone Tabler had been involved with romantically. They trusted him. That trust is what made it easy. In Tabler's mind, they were a risk. He believed they knew too much, that they could connect him to what had happened over Thanksgiving weekend. So he added their names to what he called a hit list, people he blamed for his downfall, people he convinced himself had to be silenced. What happened next wasn't about rage or jealousy. It was about control. Using familiarity and manipulation, he got close enough to take their lives, wiping out anyone he thought could talk. By the time it was over, 4 people were dead in less than a week, all because one man refused to let go of a grudge. But instead of running or hiding, Tabler did something almost unthinkable. He picked up a phone and made sure everyone knew he wasn't finished. After the first 2 killings, Tabler didn't disappear into the shadows. He did the opposite. He called the Bell County Sheriff's Office, not to confess, but to taunt them. His voice was calm as he bragged about what he'd done and warned that more violence was coming. It sounded less like fear and more like a challenge. At first, it seemed unreal. Then, just days later, he proved he meant every word. When investigators finally closed in, there was no dramatic standoff. Tabler was taken into custody quickly, and what happened next stunned even seasoned detectives. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't stay silent. He talked. During questioning, Tabler calmly laid out what he'd done, offering details only the killer could know. He described all 4 murders without hesitation, as if recounting events he'd already replayed countless times in his head. His accomplice, the teenager who filmed the first attack, was arrested as well and would later receive a life sentence. By the time Tabler stood in court, there was no mystery left about what happened. The only question was how far the consequences would go. And when the verdict came down, it changed the course of his life forever. At just 28 years old, Richard Tabler was sent to Texas death row, a place designed to erase time and break spirits. But even there, he found ways to shock people. In 2008, he pulled off something no one thought possible. He smuggled a cell phone into one of the most secure prison units in the state. What he did with it made things even worse. Tabler used the phone to call a Texas state senator and issued chilling threats, claiming he knew the names of the senator's children and where they lived. The call sent panic through the system. Prisons across Texas went into lockdown as authorities searched for contraband phones, exposing massive security failures. Behind the scenes, Tabler's mental state was unraveling. He swung between wanting to die and fighting to stay alive. He tried to take his own life more than once, and at one point came within days of execution before a last-minute delay over serious mental health concerns. Evaluations revealed deep, untreated illness, raising uncomfortable questions about whether he even understood the fate he was facing. Yet somehow, in that isolation, Tabler began to change, or at least claimed he did. And what came next would divide everyone who followed his case. Somewhere during those long years on death row, Richard Tabler turned to faith. He immersed himself in religious programs, spent hours reading scripture, and began writing, eventually publishing a memoir where he fully admitted to all 4 killings. For the first time, he spoke openly about guilt, regret, and what he called a spiritual awakening. Visitors near the end described a man who seemed broken by what he'd done, someone weighed down by remorse rather than anger. Tabler himself wrote that he no longer feared death and repeatedly asked the courts to stop his appeals and move forward with his execution. He claimed he was ready to accept the consequences. But not everyone believed him. His attorneys fought to keep him alive, arguing his mental illness made him incapable of making that choice. The back and forth dragged on for years, requests to die, then attempts to delay it, leaving the courts to decide whether his transformation was genuine or just another layer of instability. By the time the final date was set, one thing was clear. Whether redeemed or not, Tabler's story was about to end. And the way he faced his last day would become the most talked about part of all. February 13, 2025 arrived under cold rain in Huntsville, Texas. Nearly 20 years after that blood-soaked Thanksgiving weekend, Richard Tabler was led into the execution chamber. On the other side of the glass, the families of his victims took their seats, carrying 2 decades of anger, grief, and waiting. By then, Texas had eliminated special last meal requests. There were no final indulgences, no symbolic comfort, just whatever standard prison food was served that day. When people later asked what Tabler's last meal was, the answer disappointed them. There wasn't one worth remembering. His focus was elsewhere. At 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney and asked if he had any final words. Tabler turned toward the witnesses, his voice unsteady, and apologized, again and again, to the families, to his own relatives, and even to the prison staff. He quoted scripture, saying he believed death wasn't the end, but a beginning. When he finished, he looked at the warden and said, "I am finished." As the lethal drugs began to flow, he mouthed 2 silent words toward the viewing window. I'm sorry. Minutes later, his breathing slowed, his eyes closed, and the room fell silent. At 6:38 p.m., Richard Tabler was pronounced dead. When it was over, no one celebrated. In the witness room, the families sat in silence, trying to process a moment they'd waited nearly 20 years to see. For some, Tabler's death felt like justice finally catching up, an ending that had been delayed but never forgotten. For others, it brought an unexpected emptiness, proof that even closure doesn't erase what was taken. Tiffany's father later admitted the moment didn't bring peace the way he imagined. It only reminded him of how long the pain had lasted. Another family member put it more bluntly, calling the execution justice for a life that never got to grow old. Two perspectives, both shaped by the same irreversible loss. Richard Tabler died apologizing, but apologies don't undo funerals, and faith doesn't rewind time. 4 innocent lives were erased because one man couldn't let go of his anger, and the damage rippled outward for decades. His story leaves behind uncomfortable questions with no clean answers. Can someone who commits unimaginable violence truly change? Does remorse matter when the harm is permanent? In the end, this isn't just a story about execution or punishment. It's a reminder that violence casts shadows that stretch far beyond the moment it happens. Long after the final words are spoken, long after the lights go out, the scars remain.